Let's get started. I want to extend a warm greetings to all of you. I can't see all of you at the same time. You're distributed over a number of screens, 5 now. I will go through them later on. But for the moment, let me extend a warm welcome to you on behalf of myself and co-chair Guus van Westen. Together, my name is Gemma van der Haar, based here in the Netherlands. And together we chair Landok, and Landok is hosting this and welcoming you to this event, to this odd event, but also how interesting to see all those names and all those faces. Crisis forces us to improvise, and this online encounter is a result of that improvisation. Around this time, we were planning to have our annual conference, the Landok annual conference on the issue of climate change in connection to land issues. We had to postpone that to next year, but we thought it was extremely important to do something, to create a way to get together for the land governance community. And this online encounter is what we came up with. So welcome to all of you from all your corners of the world. Some of you may be regular visitors to the annual conference. Good to see you back.
Hello.
Even if it has to be under these conditions. Some of you might be joining a Landok event for the first time and have perhaps only discovered us because of this online encounter. Great to see you, and hope to be able to meet in person in some other venue at some other time. Landok is a partnership of Dutch-based universities, NGOs, and the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs on land governance for equitable and sustainable development. This online encounter that will extend over the next 5 days is our answer to the current global conditions under COVID-19. Few people in the world in the beginning of this year really understood what was coming when news came in on the first cases of this new virus. We at Landok certainly didn't. In March, we within the organizing committee still thought, oh, this will all be over in July and we can have our conference. Little did we know, as the crisis deepened in Europe and the wave of infection spread to large parts of the world, we started to grasp that this was much bigger than we had thought. And there was no way of having our conference face to face. We then decided to launch this online encounter. At first, just to fill the gap left by the conference and allow us to meet each other, even if in this way. But we also soon came to see this as a strategic opportunity to share our experiences with many of you and reflect on the many ways in which this pandemic and the mitigation measures taken to control it affect land access and land governance. So we also offer you this opportunity to reflect on these issues. Early on, a few months back already, alarming messages started to come in about evictions, about restrictions on civil society to perform their monitoring roles, concerns about due diligence, etc. Next to the harsh economic effects ripping people of their livelihoods and leading to inequality and dispossession. In this program, you will find several sessions that deal with the COVID land nexus directly. And I want to briefly draw your attention to these. This will be the webinar dedicated to this topic on Wednesday, a reflection by the Landok Fellows on, I think, that same day, but also the closing session will allow all of us to discuss these issues and bring them together. Other elements in the program, such as the keynote speeches of this afternoon, will place the COVID crisis and their impacts on land issues, land access, land politics, in broader concerns around the transformations going on globally and the shifts in land control. and other sessions will be dedicated to other important concerns that we are having around land, such as climate change and many, many other topics. So we hope that each of you will find something in the program that you will find interesting and inspiring, related to COVID or related to these broader concerns we have been having and will continue to have. In the many reflections and discussions that we will share this week, I hope you will find opportunity to learn about and to discuss what this crisis has revealed, what cracks in the system, what vulnerabilities in the ways we have organized our global economies and food systems. I hope you will also learn and discuss about how land governance is doing. How resilient are the systems that have been built? Are they able to stand up to the pressures created by COVID? We hope that you will share what you are seeing, perceiving, and analyzing. We also hope you will share what needs to be done, how to avoid that the pandemic becomes a land rights crisis and a land governance crisis. So please also take the opportunity to inspire each other on that. Landok thinks, and we have acted on the notion that it's our shared duty to understand, monitor, anticipate, and address the effects of this crisis and their interaction with other broader concerns. And there was a very nice interruption there. We hope that this online encounter will have something to offer to all of you that you can take home after this week. It would be great if you can be with us throughout the week or just today. We had about 400 people signed up for today's session. Not all of them have yet joined, but I see we have listed 140 active participants now as we speak, which I think is great. And yeah, I hope that you will find something that you need and can use and that it will help you in your work. I'm almost done. I just wanted to draw your attention to the following. This online encounter is possible thanks to the LANDac partners who have been providing inputs, ideas, etc., that you will find throughout the program. The LANDac office, Chantal and Lotte, putting everything together to make this work. And last but not least, the Land Portal. We had already started to explore the possibilities of LANDac having a more global outreach through online platforms such as these. And yeah, it's through that collaboration that we are able to organize you through Zoom today. And then on behalf, so Neil, Laura, thank you for that, and let's see where the ride takes us. On behalf of Land Portal, I have a small request that you please complete the survey that you will find at the end of this session to let us know how we did. Thank you for being here. I'm really looking forward to this afternoon and the rest of the week. Let us know what you think in all the possible ways that you can, through videos, through tweets, through the chat, etc. And then let me hand over to my co-chair, Guus van Westen.
Thank you very much, Gemma. I won't be much of an obstacle between Gemma's introduction and the main dish of today, which of course are the keynotes. I'll just add my voice to Gemma's in welcoming you all to the LANDac online encounter. I hope this will be a worthwhile week for you. And I hope to meet you in person next year. We have actually been able to convert the payment for the venue towards next year. So next year's event is already more or less paid for. This is an invitation also for them. As for now, I think in the category of silver linings, we should see this also as an opportunity to find new ways to join forces and to exchange. And who knows, that may also bring new outcomes. For now, thank you very much for your interest. And with this, I'd like to hand over to today's chair, Professor Marius.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. It's really nice to see all the people joining us and see people coming in from all over the world. My name is Marius. I'm a professor in the Anthropology of Sustainability and Livelihoods at Leiden University, and I will be the chair and moderator. This is my first time to moderate an online event, so I hope things will go okay. And I'm part of the organizing committee of the online event, together with many other colleagues in the Netherlands, as Gemma already mentioned. And this afternoon we have 3 wonderful keynote speakers who are going to share their ideas with us. And the first of these is Professor June Borras, and he's a professor of agrarian studies at the International Institute of Social Studies, the ISS in The Hague, part of Erasmus University. And he's also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Peasant Studies. In addition to that, June is a very busy man. He's also an adjunct professor at the College of Humanities and Development Studies in the China Agricultural University in Beijing, and a fellow of the Netherlands-based Transnational Institute. His work focuses on land politics, including the contemporary global resource rush, transnational agrarian movements, migrant farm workers, especially in China, Myanmar, and Vietnam, resource conflicts, climate change politics, food politics, state citizenship issues, and global agrarian transformations. Well, I'm not doing justice to everything that he does, but I'm leaving it here. I will introduce Peter Riggs and Doreen Stabinski, who will also speak today. I will introduce them later. After June's speech, keynote speech. I would like all of you to, during the talk, switch off your microphones, put yourself on mute. If you have a question, please use the chat box, and then Neil Sorensen will collect your questions and will feed them to me. After June Borras' keynote presentation, I will open up the floor very briefly, through the chat box, for questions for clarification only, because I would like to start the discussion on the keynotes after the keynotes. And I think there's also a short break in between, or is that in between? I'll check the program. But please, so questions for clarifications only, and your discussion issues, keep them in mind, but we do them after all the keynote speakers have presented. June Borras will speak for about 30 minutes, and then Peter and Doreen will each take 15 minutes. So June, welcome. We're very happy that you were willing to give this online presentation, and I'm quite curious to hear what you have to tell to us. So the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Maria, and thanks a lot. I see a lot of people I know personally, and I'm very happy to do this today. I'm playing it safe to make sure that I don't go outside what I intended to say, and within the prescribed time. So I'm reading a speaking note, and I have an outline for my PowerPoint presentation. Can we put in the PowerPoint? Can we share a screen? Slide number 1.
Neil, yeah, it's coming.
All right. The title of my address is Changing the Climate of Global Land Politics. And that's essentially the singular message that I'd like to convey in my address this afternoon. And it's different parts of it are taken from past and ongoing work, and building on a singular argument today that the main challenge is to change the climate of global land politics. Slide number 2, please. Climate change and land are linked in at least 2 ways. On the one hand, a particular kind of land politics contributes to enabling and maintaining the current global agri-food system that is fossil energy based and industrial system marked by ever-increasing distances between the spheres of production, circulation, exchange, and consumption. In turn, and currently, this sector contributes from 30% to up to 40%, depending on the estimates being given, of the global emissions. It is a food system that has created the coexistence of 1 billion hungry people on the one hand, and another billion people with food-linked health issues, especially obesity, on the other hand. What partly sustain this system are A, direct and indirect control of land by dominant social classes and corporations, and B, generous supply of cheap labor, most of whom were previously expelled from their lands. On the other hand, mainstream, as well as alternative ideas and practices of climate change mitigation and adaptation are, directly and indirectly, and to a significant extent, land-based or land-oriented. The mainstream platforms, these include those related to renewable energy, for example, biofuel, hydropower, wood chips, etc., carbon capture schemes, especially those involving forest conservation, and the so-called productive, efficient, and resilient agriculture, repackaged as climate-smart agriculture by the World Bank and FAO. The dominant narrative seems to suggest that for the first dimension, that is land and agri-food system, the way forward is to intensify a greater degree of efficiency and productivity, especially in the sphere of production, so that there is no need to maintain extensive land areas or clear-cut new forest for cultivation. One implication of this is that the rise in popularity of proposed solutions, including massive campaign towards sedentarization of mobile types of production systems, shifting agriculture to sedentary agriculture, mobile pastoralism to ranching, artisanal fishing to intensive industrial aquaculture. Combined, these affect vast rural populations and land, water, grazing areas, wetlands, and forests. In the second dimension of this link, the emerging consensus is to make sure that land tenure security is institutionally in place in any climate change mitigation and adaptation policy or project. For example, protection and promotion of tenure security in a REDD+ project, or relocation with compensation in large-scale hydropower dams, and so on. I have not heard anyone who disagrees with the idea of promoting land tenure security in the context of climate change public action. When an objectively polarizing and fiercely contested concept, in this case, social relations in land property, suddenly generates a global apparent consensus, namely the need for land tenure security, then it's an invitation to scrutinize the concept around which a consensus seems to be apparent. I'll return to this matter after a discussion of 2 related points. First, a fuller understanding of the link between climate change and land requires an explicitly political understanding of climate change mitigation and adaptation. I deliberately use the term climate change politics, which I define as the dynamics operating in the spheres of social structures, institutions, and political agency, namely social relations, policies, treaties, laws, procedures, and norms, projects, programs, narratives, ideas, advocacies, mobilizations, and social movements, memories, rumors, gossips, separately and in clusters, among and between social classes and groups within the state and in society that set and shape the meanings of climate change, its causes and consequences, and how it can be addressed by whom, where, and when. Formal climate change policies or projects labeled as climate change mitigation or adaptation measures, such as big conservation projects or projects on renewable energy, tend to be the focus of most academic inquiries and public debates. But these are not the only ones that matter. Social relations of production and ecological and political conditions of nature could be altered not by climate change per se or climate change policies or projects, but by wild speculations, rumors, gossips, or spectacles inspired or triggered by purported measures to address climate change. For example, many land speculators, swindlers, scammers, brokers have carried out their scheme by invoking the urgent task of addressing climate change through corporate plantation to produce feedstock for biofuel, whether it is real or not, or only speculated. Looking at climate change politics allows us to see a wider range of actually existing social processes, as messy as they are. Slide number 4, please. Oh, that's the, I forgot to say, to change that. That's the definition of climate change politics. And go now to slide number 4. Yeah. Second, there are twin narratives that both reflect and shape the nexus between climate change politics and land. Namely, that some types of agrarian systems, especially shifting agriculture, mobile pastoralism, artisanal fishing, are economically inefficient and ecologically destructive, or both. On the one hand, it is purportedly economically inefficient, partly because the land is used in extensive manner, labor tends to be underutilized, and land is controlled by less entrepreneurial producers who cannot be economically competitive. The history of capitalist intrusions into the countryside of many societies is a history of persistent attempts at taking land from the hands of those assumed to be inefficient land users and from inefficient land uses through expulsion or subsumption in order to facilitate the development of modern capitalist agriculture and animal herding through sedentary farming, ranching, or industrial aquaculture. On the other hand, it is ecologically destructive because they supposedly cause deforestation, carry out bush burning, and cause overgrazing. There has been a long history of central states' attempts at blaming shifting agriculture and mobile pastoralism for ecological degradation, leading to cycles of attempts at sedentarization of peasants and pastoralists. In recent years, climate change is being increasingly deployed as a reason to pursue sedentarization, even when the real reasons behind can be something else, ranging from state military building interests to capturing vast tracts of land that could be released once sedentarization is done. Separately, each of these two narratives is quite powerful in recasting social relations in land. Together, they can be explosive. And this is exactly what is happening today in many parts of the world. These two narratives are important backdrop to our discussion about the consensus around so-called land tenure security. This consensus has become entrenched in various quarters, from national governments that absurdly promote land deals in the name of land tenure security, to multilateral agencies that champion privatization and commodification of the commons. The IPCC Climate Change and Land Report of 2019 is within such a mode and historical conjuncture. It is important that IPCC had launched such a report, and it is absolutely positive that it dedicated a full chapter in it about land tenure security. Yet, a major pitfall of the report is in taking the same position of promoting an specified generic notion of land tenure security. There are two problems in relation to supporting and sustaining the apparent concession around two generic notion of land tenure security. Slide number 5, please. The first problem with not specifying what we mean by land tenure security is that it can mean anything. Laws, policies, or concepts emerge, but they do not self-interpret nor self-implement. The actual interpretation and implementation of such concepts occur via a messy and conflict-ridden interaction between competing, often antagonistic social classes and groups within the state and in society. Oops. In this context, and left on its own, the concept of land tenure security is most likely to be interpreted against the interest of marginalized social classes and groups. This is because the climate of global land politics during the last 4 decades has been very much about promoting formal land property systems, whether private and individual or customary and community types, that can enable and facilitate the commodification of land in a neoliberal manner. Capitalists or climate change entrepreneurs want security of their investments. They tend to prefer dealing with groups with formal community land registration if individuals with private land titles or formal state allocation are not available, than face risks and uncertainty of having no formal documents to hold on to. For capitalists who need land, the key objective is the capture of land control through a variety of mechanisms: purchase, lease, outgrowership arrangement, or state allocation. Thus, formalization of an indigenous community claim over their land may very well be just what a mining company wanted, so that they can securely capture a piece of land by having a formal agreement with a faction of the elites of a community via some form of a free, prior, and informed consent gained through questionable means. There are at least 5 key global documents that together created and sustain the current climate of global land politics today. A, the 2003 Land Policies for Growth and Poverty Reduction is a fundamental document by the World Bank that synthesizes the short history of the global push for the neoliberalization of land policies, while framing the thrust forward into the future. B, market-assisted land reform, which was inaugurated in a nationwide scale in 1980 in Zimbabwe, is based on the idea that some potential productive producers need to own some land to farm, but that they should get this land only through a voluntary willing seller, willing buyer scheme, meaning no landlords should be coerced to give up their land, and the potential buyers should be assisted through loans to be able to buy land. C, The 2008 World Development Report reinforces the first two policy frameworks and embed them deeper in a broader area, in a broader idea of what agriculture, of how agriculture can serve a neoliberal path to national development, partly by promoting efficiency and productivity in land use and agriculture, especially in assisting non-efficient land users to get out of agriculture, while assisting efficient producers to get inserted into capitalist commodity chains. D, the World Bank 2011 report that offers a framework on how to view and manage global land grabbing by building on the first three frameworks I just mentioned in order to maximize the full potential of large-scale land investments. It explains why and how it is important to get rid of inefficient land users and land uses, as long as land users are well informed of the process of their expulsion and are somehow compensated. And E, the World Bank and FAO's climate smart agriculture is essentially a bundling of the four policy frameworks I just mentioned and sensitize these to climate change context. It stands on three pillars of productivity, efficiency, and reduced emissions. Embedded in the broader design of neoliberal capitalist development that has dominated the world during the past 4 decades, the ideas and practices in and out of these policy frameworks have contributed in part to enabling or legitimizing the phenomenal increase in number of working people in very precarious social conditions. This is seen in the huge number of working people in the informal sector, numbering to at least 1 billion, without regular jobs, no healthcare, no pension, no social insurance, and most of whom have earlier been dispossessed of their means of production and reproduction, especially land. In addition, the number of internally displaced population worldwide stood at 80 million in 2019. Finally, those who remain on the land are either constantly threatened with dispossession or have already been subsumed by capitalist enterprises or by big conservation projects in a subordinated manner through a variety of leasing, outgrowership, or stewardship arrangements, formalizing existing land property relations in settings marked by inequality and past cycles of dispossession and displacement, devoid of any sense of history and social justice, is likely to result in formalizing inequities. The second problem with not specifying what we mean by land tenure security is that even when it is interpreted in a positive pro-poor manner, almost always it is often interpreted in an isolated, localized, scattered, project-level scope and scale. Where governments are forced to address contentious land issues, they usually address these in piecemeal, project-oriented petty reforms, such as relatively small formal land titling projects here and there. Meaning, for example, and hypothetically, in a given country where the problem of landlessness concerns 5 million households, the response of the state, donor organizations, and NGOs is to launch a land titling project that could potentially benefit 10,000 people. But 10,000 people and 5 million households are very different numbers. Overall, in the agrarian front worldwide, what we saw during the past 4 decades was the rise of petty reform in incrementalism, shying away from system-wide transformative deep social reforms. It promotes reforms within the framework of what is doable, leading to its inability or unwillingness to even try to go beyond the limits imposed by the status quo. I am not dismissing the value of small reforms, not at all. What is being questioned is the approach that promotes small reforms now that prevent deep social reforms in the future, or small reforms in lieu of deep social reforms, instead of small reforms that could be ratcheted up towards deep social reforms. When a petty reform-centric approach becomes routinized, normalized, naturalized, and entrenched, it amounts to petty reform incrementalism or petty reformism. It is what partly defines the current climate of global land politics that we are in at this historical juncture. This already complicated climate of global land politics has become even more so because of the COVID-19 pandemic. In my opinion, a relevant question about land in relation to the pandemic is less about whether there will be an upswing of land grabs by big corporations at the level of 2008. For sure, it is likely that there will be cases of land grabs, as some sporadic initial reports indicate. But what is most likely to happen, or is already happening as we speak, is that the pandemic and the economic downturn it has caused is likely to push many poor working people into greater desperation. Many of them lost jobs or unable to work their land, unable to migrate to work, or to sell their produce. When that happens, distressed land sales and leasing out are likely to follow. This is a dream come true situation for layers of land speculators, swindlers, scammers, and brokers, and also a rare opportunity for upward mobility for rich farmers or diaspora to accumulate more land. And when it happens, it is likely to be at a great scale and difficult to track and quantify. What is to be done? My starting assumption is that climate justice without agrarian justice is not at all possible. Elsewhere, I and my collaborator, Jennifer Franco, started to float the idea of agrarian climate justice as an insufficient but necessary component of a positive future where both socioeconomic crisis and ecological crisis, inherently linked as they are addressed not as two separate phenomena, but ultimately as a unified socioeconomic and socio-ecological processes. Slide number 7, please. Okay, 7, yeah. There are two urgent tasks. The first task is to contest the consensus around a generic notion of land tenure security by advancing a very specific agenda that concretely defines what tenure means, whose tenure, and for what broader purposes in terms of what social system. The second task is to change the climate of global land politics. Concretely, it means instead of a generic land tenure security, it is important to specify the agendas of land redistribution, recognition, and restitution, sandwiched by the concepts of minimum access and land size ceiling, and firmly based on social justice principles. First, in recent decades, there has been a massive increase of working people who work and live in precarious social conditions, as we just mentioned earlier, most of whom have been expelled from their lands or were born without any possibility of having access to land for productive and reproductive purposes. They need redistribution of land for full-time farming, for part-time farming, for animal grazing, community forests, food gardens, or housing in both rural and urban spaces. Second, there are many rural dwellers, especially indigenous peoples, ethnic minorities, women, today who still have access to land, but they are increasingly threatened by dispossession. They need social justice-oriented recognition of their rights to their land as a resource and territory. Third, waves of wars, militarization, violence, disasters, or displacements caused by extractive industries have resulted in the number of internally displaced peoples to swell. They need restitution programs with an emphasis on the restitution of the broader social order that was disrupted, and not an individualized land-centric private land claims that marks nearly all of the handful existing land restitution programs today. Redistribution, recognition, and restitution are urgent and necessary. However, they will work only in an institutional and political settings where the right of the working people to a minimum access is guaranteed and paired with a society-wide land size ceiling or a cap, something that was fundamental in conventional redistributive land policies during the past century, but became a policy taboo under neoliberalism. The idea of a cap is crucial in climate change politics in terms of reducing emissions. Without a cap to emissions, a country can pursue concrete but scattered climate change mitigation and adaptation and celebrate successful projects here and there, even when its overall level of emission remains constant or is even increasing. At the global land front, a cap to put a limit to how much individuals and corporations can accumulate in land is key. Without that, every individual, corporations, and bank that can afford to accumulate land will be able to do so without any limit, as what is happening now, leaving less or even nothing to those who actually or potentially depend on land to survive. Without such an indivisible principles of minimum access and land size ceiling, dispossession and land accumulation are likely to result from most of land-oriented climate change mitigation and adaptation measures, while the post-pandemic world is likely to be marked by an ever-increasing number of working people who become completely separated from their land. Without this system-wide recasting in land relations, even desirable climate change mitigation projects, such as a 10,000 hectare forest conservation, can, at best, result in a situation where we conserve a little here while someone else plunders 100,000 hectares of land nearby, or an organization managed to conserve an island of healthy forest in a sea of starving rural working people. Slide number 8, please. What is needed is a strategy of what is possible in order to counter the currently influential idea and practice of what is doable. The difference between the two is that what is doable works within the limits and possibilities of what is doable within a given balance of social forces. Whereas what is possible takes an insurgent approach to disrupt a given balance of social forces in order to pursue transformative deep social reforms that are otherwise unthinkable, and daring to tackle political agendas that are absurdly difficult but not impossible. And here is important to take the reminder from Eric Olin Wright. Pessimism is intellectually easy. It often reflects a simple extrapolation of past experience into the future. Our theories of the future, however, are far too weak to really make confident claims that we know what cannot happen. The appropriate orientation towards strategies of social transformation, therefore, is to do things now which put us in the best position to do more later by working to create those institutions and structures that increase rather than decrease the prospects of taking advantage of whatever historical opportunities emerge, unquote. Key is to situate the issues of climate change and land and their nexus within a social justice framework. In this context, and ultimately, there are two challenges. One, to specify what land tenure security means by advancing the notions of redistribution, recognition, and restitution, sandwiched by the indivisible principles of minimum access and land size ceiling. And two, to specify the broader social system in general and agri-food system in particular, within which ideas and practices of land tenure security are currently embedded, and for what kind of alternative social system and agri-food system it ought to be embedded. A subsequent question here becomes, can climate crisis caused largely by global capitalism be resolved by the same capitalist logic? This is a fair, although difficult question.
June, can I interrupt? Sorry. Can you have 2 minutes left?
Oh, I think I'm done in less than 1 minute. Yeah.
Thanks.
It is a fair but difficult question that we need to raise in the current popular discussions about a Green New Deal, for instance, for a post-pandemic global social reconstruction. In closing, I would say that changing the climate of global land politics is absurdly difficult, but unavoidable. The current crisis of climate change and the pandemic can become a rare opportunity for us to push for radical, positive, deep social reforms that previously were unthinkable. Thank you very much.
Oh, well, thank you very much, June, for an inspiring discussion, presentation, and indeed linking the climate change issue to the current COVID-19 pandemic. So thank you very much. Are there any questions for clarification? And please save your points for discussion for later, because we're going to have some time for discussion after all the keynotes. No, I think there's no questions for clarification. So, but it was a very clear talk. Thank you very much. But I'm sure that in the discussion, there will be many people who will come back to some of the points you just raised. So thank you very much. I would now like to give the floor to Peter Riggs and Doreen Stabinski for the next presentation. And Peter Riggs, I will introduce them briefly. And again, I can't do justice to what they all have done and are still doing. That would take up all the time. So I'll just give you a very brief summary. Peter Riggs is the director of Pivot Point, which is a non-profit corporation based in Washington State in the USA. And he's the convener of the global network CLARA, which stands for Climate Land Ambition Rights Alliance. And previously he held program officer positions at the Ford Foundation, at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the Open Society Institute, and he was a senior fellow at Packard Foundation. He obtained his a master degree at Oberlin College in the USA and a master degree at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne in the UK. And also very interesting, he's a commercial shellfish grower and he grows oysters and clams. Doreen Stabinski is a professor at the College of the Atlantic, where she studies the impacts of climate change on agriculture and food security. and on the emerging, she studies the emerging issue of loss and damage from slow onset impacts of climate change. She also serves as an advisor to a number of governments and international NGOs in ongoing negotiations under the UN framework Convention on Climate Change, and she participates in numerous intergovernmental forums. I'm only going to mention here the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, the UN Food and Agricultural Organization, and the World Trade Organization, but there are many, many more. And today they are going to present from a report they compiled on the missing pathways in terms of climate change mitigation. So the floor is yours. I don't know who's going to start, Doreen or Peter?
I'm going to start. Thank you. Good day, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here and really a pleasure to be following Dr. Boris. That was an excellent framing lecture to set our work inside of or in conversation with. And on behalf of Peter and myself, and really on behalf of all of Clara, I want to thank you all for the opportunity to present ourselves and our work. So we were asked to speak about this report that we published in 2018 called Missing Pathways to 1.5 degrees C. And then we were asked to, because of the current context, to connect it to the current COVID crisis. We're going to toss the microphone back and forth between us as we do that. I'm going to start by saying a little bit about the report in general, and then some of the agriculture findings. Peter is going to continue on with findings on rights and forests. I'll step back in and suggest a few lessons we might draw that are relevant now in the time of COVID. And then Peter will wrap everything up. So to start, why did we write this report, Missing Pathways, and what's the title all about? We wrote the report in the context of the climate debate after Paris. So after the Paris Agreement is finalized, and it's in 2015. It's also we're also writing the report in the context of the IPCC reports on 1.5 and land that would be written and released in 2018 and 2019. But also in response to the 4th and the 5th assessment reports of the IPCC, where significant mitigation potential is found in the land sector. So, the Paris Agreement revised our ideas, it revised our political thinking about temperature limits from some 2 degrees C limit, which had been in the discourse until Paris, to 1.5, and setting 1.5 as that new limit. It does a couple of things. It calls attention to the very serious implications for agriculture and livelihoods, even with a 1.5 degree limit. But it also makes the mitigation challenge ahead of us even greater. And of course, there's quite a lot of then intensive looking for where are we going to find the mitigation, and forces looking towards the mitigation potential in land, which is of course set up by the earlier IPCC reports. The report findings of the IPCC, they've had an inordinate focus on large scale technological mitigation solutions like bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. These are things that are written into climate models. The models didn't, have very little reality checks associated with them. In the 5th assessment report, the amount of terrestrial carbon sequestration that was assumed to be possible, particularly through bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, was, well, let's just say it was rather shockingly large, the amount of land-based mitigation. And so we wrote the Missing Pathways report as the IPCC was writing its 1.5 report. It was meant to be a counterpoint to what was being produced in the IPCC models. And we asked the question, what are the possible pathways? What are some possible pathways to 1.5 that don't involve sequestering large amounts of carbon through as yet non-existent large-scale technological options like bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. And we focused on the land sector. We said what pathways are missing from the IPCC account, because you can't easily translate them into an integrated assessment model. And because of the nature of the 1.5 challenge, that there's a significant amount of mitigation that needs to happen, we understood that the pathways that we were looking for were transformational in character in some way. And I really appreciate and think back to Dr. Boris's mentioning of what is possible, of the transformation of social systems, because that's very much how we were framing our thinking, not what is doable, but what is possible. Who were we to write such a report? Well, we're a group of non-governmental and social movement organizations from around the world. We start with a set of common principles and assumptions about the world and the communities that we work in, or that we work with. And a couple of those starting principles. One, addressing climate change requires radical transformational change based on equity. Principle 2, land is crucial for food security and food sovereignty. And a third principle, land must be managed with a rights-based approach, ensuring public participation and preserving livelihoods. We acknowledge that small-scale producers produce the majority of food globally. They produce it for local, not global markets, and that small-scale producers feed the world. We know that people and human rights are a critical part of any analysis. Real solutions have to get beyond carbon. And when looking at these really big mitigation numbers, which sometimes draw us just to look at where's all the carbon, we can't ignore what's happening on the ground. We actually have to look in communities and ecosystems. We assume that there's a set of interlocking global crises. This isn't just a climate crisis. It's a climate crisis, it's a biodiversity crisis, it's a rights crisis, and all of those crises are in a context of global inequality and increasing global inequality, and those systems that construct and perpetuate that inequality. So some of our key findings on climate change and agriculture. Well, so one of our key findings is that we need to, or key starting points, is that we need to work from first principles. And those are the principles of the right to food and the principles of agroecology, such as the recycling of nutrients and systems rather than the exogenous addition of nutrients, and the really sort of foundational role that diversity plays in agroecosystems across time and across space. We also conclude that there are substantial contributions to a 1.5 degree pathway that can be found in the agriculture sector through both reduction in emissions and removals by sinks and in carbon sequestration. In agriculture, the reductions in emissions come from reducing the use of nitrogen fertilizers, synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, and relying on natural sources of fertility, and also limiting animal production and consumption. And I'll say right from the start, and very, I think, emphasize very much, when we're talking about limiting animal production and consumption, we're very much focused on the global north, in places where animal production and consumption is far in excess of human needs. We're not talking about animal production and consumption for the most part in the global south. And we also found substantial contributions in sequestration. There's a bracketing, a caveat there in terms of the temporary nature of carbon sequestration. And much of the sequestration possibility that we looked at was in agroforestry systems. So agroforestry and agro-civil pastoral systems, expanding and enhancing the huge variety of those systems around the world, we saw could sequester up to a gigaton of carbon a year. And I'm not going to go into the details of carbon amounts. We know that agriculture has to be a focus of both mitigation and adaptation. It's impossible to just look at agriculture from a mitigation perspective because of the very serious impacts of climate change on agriculture, temperature rise, impacts on water quality and availability, desertification, land degradation, all of those with critical impacts on food security, which is why 1.5 degrees is such an important number. And as with all other greenhouse gas intensive sectors, the challenge is really transformation. Tinkering around the edges won't do. We can't just make incremental adjustments to an industrial agricultural system that's responsible for close to a quarter of current global emissions. Incremental adjustments will fall far, far short of what is needed. How we produce our food, where and for whom, will need to change profoundly. Let me just give you two brief examples before I pass the mic to Peter. One, we tell the story in the report of farmers on the island of Puerto Rico after a series of devastating hurricanes wiped out large-scale cash crop production of sugarcane, of coffee, of bananas, this large above ground trees and such. And farmers transitioning to what they call agricultura subterránea, underground agriculture, recognizing that they needed to move from cash crops to food crops, which were root-based, so yams and cassava, etc., which would continue to provide income and food in times of disaster. It's those sorts of radical system changes that we think are the transformative types of changes that we need to be imagining and making happen as we address climate change. The other example, and this is an example that's based on research by Ellen Roos in Sweden, is this idea of ecological leftovers, of the complete transformation of how we produce meat, where we're feeding not food crops to animals, but we're feeding leftovers, food scraps, crop residues to animals. We're producing animals on grasslands, which are appropriate for animal feeding, not converting those grasslands to corn and soy production for animals, but keeping the carbon stores in the grasslands while animals are on those grasslands. The ecological leftovers approach, our estimate is, something like 4.5 gigatons of emission reductions per year. It means massively reducing the amount of meat that's consumed, and as I said earlier, in the global north. But it's a transformation in agricultural, in animal production that has significant emission reduction potential. So let me turn it over to Peter now for a little bit. Peter?
Great, thanks very much, Doreen. And I will be showing a couple of slides that illustrate the points that Doreen has just expressed. Hope that you can see me, and I hope I can now share screen. Just a moment, please. Sorry, there it is. Okay. Hope everybody can see this, as Doreen referred to Pathways report. I just wanted to say one more word about how Clara came together. We came together prior to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change meeting in Paris. So we're a pre-Paris Agreement organization. And we came to Clara from one of three directions, either from a community land rights and community-based natural resource management perspective, from an interest in agroecology and food security, and finally, forest restoration professionals and others who sought to move beyond the model of industrial forestry. And all of us within Clara were concerned, first, that rights-based approaches were being overtaken by technological approaches, and perhaps most importantly, at a political level, within the climate change negotiations, agriculture, forestry, and rights-based interests didn't have a common platform. They didn't have a way to recognize each other and work together. So there wasn't an opportunity yet to pursue what Dr. Boras has called agrarian climate justice. We do hope that Clara brings some of that in. Okay. Hopefully that you can all see that. Can I just get a little bit of feedback to make sure that you can hear me?
Yes.
All is good? Okay, very good. And you can see the slide, yeah? So there are a lot of threes in this talk. 3 ways that land tenure is misunderstood as a climate solution, 3 special cases on land tenure and climate, 3 forest management legacy problems, 3 natural and working land sequestration pieces. They're often called climate wedges. And then depending on time, we may get into some of the other puzzle pieces. I'll quickly run through those and then conclude with 3 hopeful messages. Okay, let's start with land tenure security. And let's note by stating that land tenure security, when rooted in a social justice framework, is itself a climate solution. Security of land and title generally increases the time horizons that farmers and landowners will use to make management decisions, and many of the most effective climate mitigation solutions in the land sector, that is greater carbon sequestration, those solutions take a while to deliver the results. You might plant now, but you won't see the big carbon sequestration gains until a decade or more. But land tenure is misunderstood as a climate solution in 3 ways. First, it's sometimes treated as an output, when in fact, secure land tenure within a social justice framework is a precondition for success of all other mitigation and adaptation efforts. And I believe here as well, I'm echoing Professor Boras. In lands across 64 countries currently store almost 300 gigatons of carbon. And it's worth noting that only 1/3 of the carbon identified in community lands lie in areas with secure tenure rights. A second misunderstanding of the problem, technology-based large-scale mitigation solutions are too often planned in ways that disregard existing land uses and the livelihoods of entire communities, and this sets up center-periphery conflicts, as Dr. Boras has just described. Third, much of the language in the UNFCCC, in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, is based on the discourse of, quote, avoided deforestation, as opposed to a much more active frame of reforestation and forest regeneration. It isn't just about avoiding deforestation, also dealing with the greatly reduced carbon stocking that currently exists in much of the world's forests, as well as recovery of the 1/3 of global forests that in this century have been lost. This question of the scope of engagement actually becomes very important when we talk about the baselines that countries use to report on their climate performance, because all countries, through what's called a nationally determined contribution, an NDC, is required to report to the UNFCCC about its performance. And there's a lot of gamesmanship, a lot going on around the construction of these baselines. So we may come back to that. Okay, I mentioned 3 special cases. The first is the special case of Indigenous peoples. And here's what we need to remind ourselves. Indigenous peoples are the holders of most of the world's biodiverse areas. And so they play an essential role in conservation, the guardianship of that diversity and the carbon associated with that. It is not being rewarded at anything close to the value that that large carbon sink plays in regulating the planet's climate. Funding for climate mitigation has generally gone through central governments and frequently reduces the space for self-determination by Indigenous peoples. Although this is changing, there are some exciting initiatives that maybe we can talk about later. The second special case is REDD+. When I mentioned the focus on avoided deforestation, this is the main example of what I meant. Red stands for reduction in emissions from deforestation and degradation, and it draws upon the simple insight that forests left standing should be valued in such a way that countries aren't tempted to liquidate them simply for balance of payment reasons. So this has led to the concept of results-based, the result of not cutting down your forest. This is all good, but now there are plans to allow countries to sell carbon credits that are created by avoided deforestation and forest restoration. They would allow those credits to be sold to the airlines, and that would be used to offset, meaning to cancel out, the continued emissions from air travel. There's a longer story there. We'll leave that for now. The third special case is China. Most people are surprised to learn what a large percentage of the world's forested lands under community control and management is in fact in China. China has created a very different community management model, usually one with a very strong market orientation, often focused on the production of particular specialty crops. But importantly, the Chinese forestry sector is not now, and really never was, dominated by timber interests. And thus it's very different than most national forest bureaucracies, and it's created a very different path for development. The Chinese model is generally not what we think of when we think about indigenous management, but there's a lot of really exciting stuff going on, and I think what's happening with the Chinese model for devolution of control is worth our further study. Okay, so back to the Missing Pathways report. Our research showed a tremendous opportunity to help cool the planet by regrowing forests. We identified 3 major climate wedges associated with forest management. Again, I'll get to those in a moment, but I also did want to note briefly 3 forest management legacy problems. The first legacy problem is us. That is consumers in wealthy countries and just a consumer orientation generally. A lucrative international timber trade combined with the globalization of chains means that market demand for international forest commodities drives legal and illegal logging and forest destruction. International timber and livestock trade needs to be aligned with Paris Agreement goals to prevent temperature rise. The second legacy problem is the over-centralization of forest management. Devolving control to communities is essential, and Dr. Borras has described some of the opportunities, but also some of the challenges associated with combating that over-centralization. Third, and in my part of the world, the most significant legacy problem has been a scientific and production orientation towards maximizing efficiencies in dimensional lumber and biomass, not an orientation towards maximizing ecosystem integrity, which would help local communities and also provide regional benefits. Legacy problems. We also see a history of fire suppression in some areas as a legacy problem, and finally a history of conflict and exclusion as a legacy problem in other areas. So this is partly what complicates our efforts to treat forests as a proper climate solution. Okay, let's do a little bit with the numbers. Hope you can all see this now. This illustrates some of what Dr. Stabinsky was talking about and a little bit of what I've just mentioned. I hope you can see my cursor. Over here is the potential for reduction in emissions in agriculture. As you can see, the business as usual scenario has 11 gigatons per year of CO2 equivalent. There's the potential to reduce that amount down to just 4 gigatons a year. Anybody who tells you you can go to 0 in the agriculture sector is either poorly informed or lying. And at the same time, there is the opportunity to significantly. For land use, we have a picture whereby we could convert forests as a source of emissions into a net sink. So currently, under a business as usual scenario with continued forest destruction, forests would continue to be a source of emissions at the level of about 6 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year. We found a mitigation potential in land use total of 15 gigatons per year, which would lead to a net of -9 or -10 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year. Okay, so those are big numbers. Those are important activities, but let's look at this green graph over here on the right. At least by 2050, at least 1,000 gigatons of CO2 equivalent is stored in forests and soils of community-held lands. Again, not all of those larger than the numbers demonstrated in these flux approaches in agriculture and forestry. Hope that you can hear me. I hope I didn't drop out for a minute there. So just to make the point that the community held lands are absolutely determinative in climate action, and the stores held under community management should not be compromised any further. And in fact, we need to go the other direction. So what does that other direction look like? Here's some more of the numbers. On the left side are the specific wedges that Dr. Stabinsky talked about. You'll notice the largest wedge is 4.5 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year using the ecological leftovers approach. Healthy diet matters, reducing food waste matters, and all of that leads to a major share of avoided emissions from agriculture. 7.5 gigatons a year is possible, as well as an increase in sequestered carbon through agroforestry. Moving to the graph on the right side here, and these are roughly comparable in scale, we see that sequestered carbon is the much larger opportunity in the forest sector with responsible forest use, natural forest expansion, and forest ecosystem expansion. There's also some avoided emissions avoided through halting deforestation and degradation, through restoring grasslands, and significantly through storing peatlands. Peatlands having a small percentage of the world's lands, but representing a remarkably large share of stored global carbon. So let me spend just a minute on these three wedges because they may not be intuitively clear. Let's start at the bottom with responsible forest use. Number of projections of the ability of forests to provide mitigation benefits. Most of those analyses, in our view, failed to account for the need for continued wood harvest. So Clara is actually quite conservative in our estimate here. We think 50% of the world's secondary forest should be allowed to regrow, whereas 50% of the current production forest area globally will need to remain that way, that is, as a permanent timber supply base. Now, there's a clear tension in most systems between maximum yield and ecosystem values, but there's also clearly a major opportunity for lots of long rotation production forestry. We devalued short rotation plantations in our analysis because, frankly, we believe that between 2025 and 2050, the most important thing we can do is carbon sequestration, and plantations simply don't give you that. Looking up on this graph to natural forest expansion, almost 4 gigatons a year. This would be the recovery of lands that had been, this would be the part of the forest estate that's allowed to regrow, 50% regrowth of currently converted or degraded areas. Also important to note that urban forestry becomes very important in this context. Urban forestry is expensive, but it also has very high co-benefit values in terms of reduced energy use and just creating a more hospitable climate in urban areas. So urban forestry is actually part of the natural forest expansion. And then finally, this wedge.
Can I interrupt you? You have about 2 minutes left. Sorry to interrupt you.
No problem. That's perfect. Okay, and then this last wedge here, forest ecosystem restoration, that remains forest, but increases its carbon values and increases its biodiversity levels as a result of restoration. Okay. So this is a summary slide. This will just show the 3 areas that we've addressed in missing pathways: the importance of Indigenous and community lands, the importance of transforming agriculture, and finally, the importance of restoring forests and other ecosystems. To leave you with 3 hopeful notes, there's a lot more going on at the landscape level. What we are arguing for is the consideration of the needs of forest-dependent communities, the needs of rural entrepreneurs, but also workers that are in plantation systems, that are in commodity-dependent systems. At a landscape level, our solutions have to work for all 3: Indigenous peoples and forest-dependent communities, rural entrepreneurs, as well as our subaltern population involved in commodity production. A second hopeful message: yes to the half Earth solution. That is, we need half the Earth to be allowed to be restored. This is a vision of E.O. Wilson and others. 30% can probably come through strict conservation. The other 20% should be managed by local communities, indigenous peoples, managed for resilience, and it will take multiple scientific disciplines for us to get there. Finally, let's see carbon pricing for forests. Let's see an actual price put on standing forests that landowners and others are rewarded for without offsetting. That is, not taking those land-based improvements and then selling them to fossil fuel producers or the airlines or what have you, which leads to no net mitigation benefit. This is part of Article 6 negotiations under the Paris Agreement. They are ongoing. Clara takes the position that we do not have the carbon budget for offsetting, but there's lots of ways to reward communities and landowners for continued forest growth. And with that, I thank you. This is such an amazing group. Just looking at the names, any one of you probably could have given this presentation. So it's a real honor and a pleasure. And I thank you very much and turn it back to the organizers here.
Well, thank you, Peter and Doreen, for, again, a very inspiring presentation. And I think the 2 presentations fit together very, very well. And what I noted in terms of commonalities is that you both sort of discuss the myths that surround this idea of the need for large-scale initiatives to offset carbon emissions, which, and June's presentation focused very much on how that negatively affects the rights of small-scale producers, but you also show us how that undermines a lot of possible innovations in the small-scale production sector. So I thought that way your presentations complemented each other very well. We haven't seen any questions coming in. Oh, yeah, I do. Mixed farming, okay. Yeah. So to me, it was very much about this sort of contradiction, and also, Doreen, what you said, that actually there's very little, all the predictions for the large scale mitigation processes have very few links to reality, which sort of supports this idea that it's about myths. But you also seem to oppose the large scale and small scale. And someone here is asking about how about sort of mixed farming? How could that address the problem? I also have a question to June. You talk about sort of a minimum access to people, but how should we define minimum access and for whom? So these are the 2 questions I have. And the first one, it comes also from Harriet Friedman. It's not just about scale, but it's also about mixing different farming systems. So who would like to start responding to these?
Well, I'm happy to start to respond to Harriet. And I think, You know, I think the agroforestry and the agro-silvo-pastoral systems and the sequestration potential that we note there actually is an answer to that question. And that is, yeah, mixed farming systems can actually be carbon neutral or can sequester carbon, right? The emissions from agriculture come from animals, they come from nitrogen sources, often exogenous nitrogen sources. And so when you're able to utilize diversity and utilize sort of recycling of nutrients rather than exogenous addition, you create those systems where you can actually massively reduce emissions, if not become sort of carbon neutral or carbon negative. I have to say, though, that it's really, really important to think about the distinction between fossil carbon and terrestrial carbon. Fossil carbon is carbon that's been under the ground for millions of years. And what we're doing is we're bringing it up and putting it into a carbon cycle. The terrestrial carbon is carbon that is in that carbon cycle. And so we can think about sequestering that carbon, but because of natural processes, that carbon is not sort of fixed and then kind of stuffed underground for millions of years, right? The potential of terrestrial carbon, it is possible for us to fix carbon, but we also need to recognize the volatility of that, the possible change of amount of carbon that is possible to sequester because of changes in climate. As climate heats up, maybe the ability of less carbon to be sequestered in the soil. And so really what we have to do right now is stop those fossil carbon emissions, use the sequestration potential as much as possible, but not assume that they're fungible, that they are absolutely equivalent, because they're not, because of that the volatile and transitory nature of terrestrial carbon.
Thanks. Can I just add briefly? I appreciate the question very much. I think this is a great example of the difference between two values. One is the value of productivity, and the other is that of efficiency. In these debates, productivity really matters, and perhaps we don't often spend enough time on it. Often, however, the concept of productivity, which can be viewed as a food production or an ecosystem carbon value, is replaced with a market term, which is efficiency, which is usually oriented towards maximizing the production of a single commodity from a piece of land. That's a very different measure. We need productivity. We should problematize this question of efficiency.
Thank you. June, would you like to come in?
Yeah. On the question of what does it mean minimum access? For a very long time, at least in agrarian studies, land has always been treated in the context of land for farming in the rural world. Especially during the past century, that was basically what it means when you talk about land. We're in the 21st century, and the world has been very much transformed, and actually a lot of different types of social categories in societies have particular kinds of land question that doesn't necessarily mean land for full-time farming in the rural areas. So you have a range of things, both for production and social reproduction purposes. That's why I mentioned for food gardens, for community gardens, for community forests, for housing, very importantly. I think this is what I mean when that becomes very important to have a minimum access for those who need land for both production and social reproduction.
We have some questions coming in. I'm very happy to hear that. First of all, there's a question by Gemma van haar about addressed to Clara. How can you combine a rights-based approach with this idea of half a planet. And that's quite, there's quite some controversy about that. There was also a question by Richard Lucius, specifically to June, saying that the issue of land scaling needs to consider the carrying capacity of land. Size alone cannot resolve the question of land access and abilities to sustain livelihoods. And then a third, and then I'll give the floor to you. Question: are there any numbers on the contribution by sea-based farming, like seaweed replacing meat? And I think that's more a question to Doreen. So who would like to start? June, would you like to start on the land sealing? You're muted.
I'm not exactly sure if I understand the question, but okay, I'll try. Well, the carrying capacity of land indeed is a very important consideration here. So no question that question of land productivity is just as important as anything else. And of course, land size ceiling on its own, or minimum access on its own, will not resolve the problem of having workable livelihoods for anyone. That's why what I was trying to convey is that the principles of minimum access and land size ceiling should always go together, and they cannot be separated. The indivisibility of minimum access. You can have minimum access. You guarantee the right, human rights based to land access, for instance, but you don't have, you don't put a cap on how much individuals and corporations accumulate in terms of land, or how much banks can foreclose and own effectively own lands. Then even your minimum access in the end will not mean much. So the idea is to sandwich this thing to make sure that you go into a more reasonable kind of distribution of access and control of resources, not in a very kind of skewed distribution in which normally 10% of landowners control 80% of land resources, as we see now in most societies today.
Thanks. Peter, would you like to come back to the question about the rights-based approach versus half a planet?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Van Haar, for this question. It's a really good question. Most of the initiatives that are 30 by 30 or half Earth, 30 by 30 means 30% of the planet should be strictly protected by the year 2030. Most of these came out of the conservation movement, and I would agree with you entirely that the conservation movement has a lot of amends to make on rights-based approaches. But personally, I don't see a conflict. I think what's very interesting is the question of how we go beyond 30% strict protected areas to a half Earth vision that very much includes rights-based approaches of Indigenous peoples and local communities, so that when we're talking about that additional 20%, the 20% that gets us from to 50, that 20% really needs to be local communities and Indigenous people's managed lands. And it may not satisfy the criteria of the conservation groups, that may not look like an adequate solution to them. But I think for most of us, from a livelihoods perspective, from a rights perspective, the idea that community-led restoration could be part of the half-Earth task, I am actually surprised that it remains controversial, but I think we need to stick to our guns and ensure that local communities, Indigenous peoples, and their management solutions are part of any half-Earth effort. Thanks.
Doreen, there was also a question to you, well, which I assigned to you on the seaweed, whether there are figures available for the contribution of sea-based farming.
Yeah, I know that there's work out there. We looked at terrestrial systems, so we didn't actually. I'm not familiar with that literature, so I'm sorry that I can't answer the question in any more detail. I wonder, Maria, if I could take on one of Gemma's questions.
Yes, I saw that one. I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat box, and Neil's helping me with that.
Yeah.
But please go ahead. So it's on the relation between COVID-19 and whether there's a link to climate change lessons.
Yeah, so whether there are lessons that we've learned about land and climate that have implications for the current crisis of COVID. And I mean, I have to say that some of what we've been writing and thinking about in terms of industrial agricultural systems and the intense vulnerability of industrial agricultural systems and very long supply chains, those vulnerabilities in climate change have actually, COVID's actually sort of showed us that those vulnerabilities are actually very real. So COVID's revealed that. And also I think, thinking about COVID, it's a warm up. Right? The COVID crisis is a warm up to these snowballing, intensifying impacts that we expect from climate change. And I guess one of the main lessons that I think is quite important is one that Dr. Boras has already mentioned, right? And that is, and I'm going to quote a couple of other thinkers, Naomi Klein and Arundhati Roy in that case. And that is, we have this sort of this time of crisis, and during a time of crisis, things can shift really, really rapidly. And things that we've never thought to be possible in the past suddenly are very, very possible. So thinking about what are the social conditions, what are the political and economic conditions for rapid, large-scale shifts and transformation in thinking, I think that COVID is showing us that those sorts of transformations are possible. Naomi Klein talks about, she quotes Milton Friedman in terms of the ideas that are lying around are really important to have those ideas lying around for those times of crisis and opportunity. Those ideas like agroecological transformations, those ideas like ecological leftovers. And I'll just end with a quote from Arundhati Roy. She says that historically pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It's a portal, it's a gateway between one world and the next. And I think for thinking about climate change, let us think about how we use this particular crisis to really give us the opportunity to think about what those transformational, what sorts of transformations we need to envision them and to use this opportunity to make them happen.
Yeah, thanks. Well, that links a bit to the question that Annelies Somers had to June, because June, you mentioned the possible exacerbating effects of the pandemic on local land rights. And Annelies says, but which concurs a bit with what you're saying, Doreen, that these big companies, some of these big companies may also go bankrupt because of the crisis, and that opens and may also open up opportunities. So how do you feel about that? And then I'll try and return to some of the questions in the chat box again. Can you respond, June?
Oh, yeah. Oh, I ended my last sentence in this in my address was basically of taking a look at the crisis, the dual crisis of climate change and the pandemic as something that can be flipped into being transformed into a rare opportunity to advance big ideas, subversive ideas into a positive future that were otherwise difficult. And this is part of, and I want to locate my discussion about that kind of thing, of that the pandemic may have bankrupt some of those land grabbers, that weakens them in a position to continue to hold on to their lands, and that they could be vulnerable to claim making from below, to return those land grab areas to the communities. And I think we might see some of those. However, the crisis unfolds in two ways. It's a double-edged sword. It can be an opportunity for progressive claim makers to advance positive agendas, or it could spiral further downward if more corporate and reactionary interests would be able to seize those opportunities. During the Great Depression in the 1930s, some of these California big farmers went bankrupt, but their lands were taken over by banks and insurance companies. And when we see economic downturn, many banks and insurance companies start to accumulate lands by foreclosing those lands, even in less spiky crises that we see. For example, in the European Union over the past few decades, many of the foreclosed lands were foreclosed by banks and insurance companies. And actually, they started to accumulate land control. So those are things that we can watch, but we always see how the political opportunity structure is being altered by the dual crisis of climate change on the climate crisis on the one hand, and the pandemic on the other hand, but it can cut both ways. That's my response to that. But then again, I come back to a powerful insurance, social insurance, if you may, for poor people, is the concept of a floor and a ceiling in terms of access and a cap to land accumulation. I also saw in the chat box a question about production and social reproduction, and a question of gender.
I was about to pose that one, yes.
Yeah. Very important to take a look at land, not just in terms of economic productive activities of farming, but to look at it also as central in social reproduction. Here, gender question becomes very central, not in isolation, but in a more intersectional kind of way, especially in the intersection of class and gender. And I think, again, the pandemic has exposed not only the vulnerability, but also the power of looking at the intersection of class, gender, and other identity questions, and affirming the need for a much more radical, deep social reforms that involve land in the context of economic production and social reproduction.
Thanks. Well, there was also a question from Tsitsi Muparari about how do you, well, when connecting land tenure and climate change in Africa, how do you picture this connection without seeking to understand the colonial paths that define land sectors and their operation? I'll take a few. There was also a question about the example of China's law and governance, and whether that might be, there was a question from Feja Nsniewska. I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name. The example of China's law and governance that Peter provided, but maybe June also has something to say about that. But Peter, this one was to you. Perhaps that example is tainted by the legal and illegal forest trade footprint beyond the country. So this is, how do we link, a question about how do we link the local to global, regional and global levels. And let me see if there's one that goes to women we've addressed. Yeah, well, let me stick to these three first. Who would like to go first? Peter, would you like to respond to the question about China? And then maybe, yeah, and then also reflect some on colonial pathways in Africa?
Sure. I'm not qualified to reflect on the colonial pathways. I put a brief response in the chat to the China question. I acknowledge that China has externalized its timber supply problem in order to protect its own forests, and it has ravaged forests in Myanmar and Eastern Russia. So this is definitely a concern. It is interesting to me, however, that China has been able to implement the kinds of community management programs it has undertaken, largely because its central forest bureaucracy is not dominated by timber interests. That strikes me as interesting and also an example of the level of paradigm shift we need. If I can take a brief moment to answer Julian Kwan's question regarding landscape level sustainable territorial development. And the answer is yes, absolutely. We talk about community management, but we think it's very important that issues be addressed at the landscape level. What I've noticed is the World Bank wants to work with rural entrepreneurs. The commodity chain justice groups want to work with plantation workers, and then a lot of land governance efforts want to work with Indigenous peoples and local communities. What I don't see are efforts that combine these very different efforts or very different interests into a landscape level approach. There's some that's starting to happen, and I appreciate the work of the Global Landscapes Forum in this regard. But again, the reminder, we're going to need solutions that work for local people, for rural entrepreneurs, as well as wage laborers within agriculture and production forestry sectors. If one of those groups is left out, we cannot look forward to sustainable solutions. Thanks.
Thanks. There's a real need for comments on the colonial pathways, I've noticed in the chat box. And then there's another question, because we have many questions coming in. We're officially supposed to move to the networking part in, well, in about 7 minutes time. That means foregoing the break. But perhaps we will still want to take a 10-minute break after we still do some of the questions, and then schedule the networking a bit later. Is that okay with everyone? But in the meantime, can any of you respond to the colonial pathways question?
I think that is specifically directed to Peter. I leave it to that. But my response to that would be a big and vague kind of thing of the need to historicize any responses, not just in a slice of time of the here and now, in which the dominant kind of thinking about land policies are very notorious in that kind of sense. Many of the societies that we see are much more complex historically. So even a positive, seemingly positive interventions such as community mapping and registration could be very tricky and be very complicated. In Myanmar, when you go into a community and you start to map with the people who are currently occupying that particular community land, probably they are only one among the 3 or 4 competing claimants, because there were already 3 or 4 waves of people who were expelled from those community and become refugees. So the importance of history is central on how to resolve this land question. That's my point on the colonial past. I saw that Julian has made an intervention here, and of course Julian is especially in this context because Julian is one of the most one of the key authors of the section on land tenure security in the climate change and land report of the IPCC. going beyond the sectoral narrowness. Oh, absolutely. We are on the same page. Going into landscape kind of approach, absolutely. I think a very narrow framing of, as I said, very narrow framing of land into land for farming in rural areas is it will not work very much on it, even among those very people that are actually needing land for farming, because most likely those people are farmers, but also pastoralists, but also fishers, but also wage workers in their community, but are also migrant wage workers on a seasonal way. They combine all these kind of activities in one go, and that's where you see the location of sectoral land becomes smaller and smaller in terms of the conventional way of framing land. So landscape there is very important. But even a landscape kind of approach, I would argue, without the floor and the ceiling and the society-wide kind of radical recasting on the rules on how to access and how much land resources will not work at all. So the elites can also recast their control over resources in the landscape kind of bigger manner. Big conservation organizations, agribusiness corporations, military operations, they tend to conspire to create their own landscape of expulsion of villagers, for instance. So I think, again, in the end, landscape as an approach is very useful and important. But it has to be made to serve a broader kind of social justice framework.
Well, I see all kinds of discussions also in the chat box between some of the speakers and some of the members of the audience. So this is very nice. It makes it for a moderator a bit complicated to follow all the chats, but it's nice to see. Well, one last question before I think I'll hand over to Neil to explain the networking through the break rooms. But that links a bit to what you were saying, and it links to a couple of the questions I think that have come in, and those are about relations, relations and power relations specifically, not just between communities and outside powerful actors, but also within communities. And how do you vision taking those into account as well? And that's a question to all of you, I think. So who would like to start? June.
Very quickly on that, I think the centrality of class and class relations and class politics become a very important thing there. When processes of land policies hit a village, when processes of forest conservation or carbon accounting arrives in a village, they don't impact upon a homogeneous community. In fact, it's a very socially differentiated and socially differentiating communities on most occasions. And those class relations are central. But it's very important to see those competing class relations in an intersectional context, as we always kind of argue that it intersects with very important identity dimensions. Gender, race, and ethnicity are among the most important ones, but so as questions of generation. But absolutely central, and this is why the importance of land tenure security has to be scrutinized and disaggregated into its important fault lines, if you may, made of social relations that are based on class and identity dimensions of it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I think we can go on for hours with this discussion. Lots of interesting questions coming up. And of course, the differences within communities complicate matters quite a bit, but are crucial to be taken into account. I would love to continue, but I think since it's already, well, 4 o'clock our time, but we have people in many different parts of the world, many different time zones. But I would like to hand over to Neil Sorensen now to explain the breakout groups to you for the networking. And perhaps we can also have a brief break so people can fill up their drinks, bathroom visits, etc. But Neil, please go ahead, and I hope you can guide us through the breakout process for the networking.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks so much. Thanks for everybody for joining us at this first session of the LANDac online encounter. I'm just going to set up breakout rooms, parallel rooms automatically. So, you know, once I open them, you will find yourself in a room with 5 or 6 different people who assigned to you randomly. So I encourage you to network and to get to know one another, and to talk about these issues, or just you know, see what learn more about each other. And so we're just trying to create a virtual space, like you may have done during the lockdown and had virtual cocktails with your family and friends. So we're trying to, you know, provide an alternative to the in-person event, and hope you can take advantage of this and get to know one another a little bit better. And I don't know if you have anything else to add before that, any closing remarks? I think after that, we'll just end.
Yeah. So in that case, I really thank you, June, Doreen, and Peter, for very inspiring keynotes. And I thank indeed all the members of the audience who've contributed to the discussion with very good questions. And I'm sorry I haven't been able to pose all of them to the speakers, but I saw that some of them were also responded to by the speakers in the chat box. As I said, it's my first time to moderate this online, and it's actually quite a challenge despite the wonderful help provided by Neil. And thanks Gemma and Guus also for their opening of this, the first day of our online encounter. Please register also for the following events. There's also a PhD event tomorrow morning, I heard. You can find all the information on the Landok website. So thanks, and I hope that you will stay with us for the networking. But maybe we can start the networking in about 10 minutes from now, to give everyone the opportunity to get a drink, go to the bathroom, well, whatever you need to do, and also give your eyes a bit of a rest from staring at the screen, because that's also quite intense. So thank you very much. I hope to see you in the next event, and I hope to meet some of you during the virtual breakout room, because I'm also going to participate, and I hope that our speakers will also participate in the breakout sessions. Thank you for your presentations, and thanks the audience for their questions.